Question: Are we the 10 Toes Nation generation? Welcome to the Final 14 Years YouTube channel. I'm Daniel, and today's date is the 19th of November, 2025. Thanks for joining me as we ponder the prophetic together in this short video, in which I'll give you my take on how King Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a prophetic image depicts all the successive Middle Eastern empires that would rise and fall up until the final generation empire that would experience the second coming of Christ, as detailed in the book of Daniel, chapter 2, verse 31 through 45. Here in the book of Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 through 45, we see the description of the image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, which depicts world history starting from ancient Babylon up until the final generation that will experience Christ's second coming. I highlighted some key sections of this passage that I would like to emphasize. First, we have the image's head of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, 2 legs of iron, 2 feet and 10 toes being part of iron and part clay mixed together. Some key things about these elements immediately stuck out to me regarding their origins. Gold and silver are not innate to Earth, as they are understood to have originated from the core of stars. Brass is made of terrestrial copper and zinc, which are innate to Earth's crust. Iron, like gold and silver, originates from the core of stars and is not innate to Earth. Clay, however, is innate to Earth. This concept of terrestrial and celestial origins both eventually being found on the Earth together is a key point in that humans are innate to the Earth, whereas spiritual entities are by nature extraterrestrial in origin, as they are referred to as celestial bodies or stars per Genesis chapter 1 and Psalm 147 verse 4, and came to earth per Genesis chapter 6 and Jude chapter 1 verse 6 and Genesis 28:12 and John 1:51. But next, we then see a cosmic stone that is cut out without hands, which the builders rejected in Psalm 118:12, which is extraterrestrial in origin and not innate to the earth, which is a metaphor for Christ. Then comes to the earth and strikes this terrestrial image at its feet and destroys the entire image, breaking it into pieces and scattering all the elemental pieces from off the planet, which are said to no longer be found afterwards. This is symbolic to Christ returning to earth in order to destroy the entire age of commingled rule of human and fallen angel, principality, and spirits in high places over the earth. Notably, these elemental pieces are subtly personified as beings, seeing that in verse 35 it states, "The wind carried them away," which no place was found for them, meaning that they are entities that are no longer discoverable on the planet upon Christ's destruction of them. Then afterwards, this stone, Christ, that struck and broke the image, became a great mountain that filled the entire earth, which depicts Christ's second coming to the earth at the Battle of Armageddon to defeat all of his commingled physical and metaphysical enemies. Again, just like we noted with the characteristics of the specific elements that comprise the parts of the image, I want to focus on the other subtle connotation and differentiation of the terrestrial and extraterrestrial aspects detailed within this passage, as we continue to see referenced in that King Nebuchadnezzar would rule where the children of men live, which is terrestrial bound earth, which would seem logical and no need to mention unless it is noted to specify a significant differentiation of something else not earthbound. Then we see the mention of beasts of the field and fowls of heaven also being under Nebuchadnezzar's rule. However, there is no mention of any aquatic life, which I find interesting, but I'll leave that for another video. But the differentiation of children of men appears to define a separation of species, likely condoning the difference between physical and metaphysical spiritual entities, such as the principalities and spirits in high places, which are also known to have a realm of dominion amongst humans, per Ephesians chapter 2 verse 2, Ephesians chapter 6 verse 12, and John chapter 12 verse 31. Now, focusing on the feet and toes, they were noted to be comprised of specifically potter's clay, in which clay is correlated to humans, which are fashioned by God as the potter and we as the clay, per the metaphor given in Isaiah chapter 64 verse 8, and iron, which I've heard several takes on this being analogous to either technology or aliens, but I think it represents fallen angels, especially noting the correlation with this mixture of iron and clay being associated with a divided kingdom, in which Christ referenced a divided kingdom in regard to that of Satan and his fallen angels in Matthew chapter 12 and Mark chapter 3. The mixing of the physical and metaphysical spiritual world is also noted to be a hallmark of this final generation, per details given in the book of Revelation chapter 16 verse 12, when the sixth angel pours out the sixth-bowl judgment upon the earth, and the great river Euphrates dries up to make way for the kings of the east. And then John states that he saw 3 unclean spirits of the devil, like frogs, come out of the mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet, which then go into the kings of the earth and of the whole world for the purpose of getting them to come to the battle of Armageddon, which is a single battle that occurs at the second coming of Christ at the 7th and final bowl judgment. Notice that these unclean devil spirits did not come out of the river Euphrates when it dried up, but rather these spirits came out of the mouths of these 3 end-time entities, being that of the dragon Satan, the beast Antichrist, and false prophet. However, Scripture further details how Christ will eventually come to completely destroy these commingled demon-possessed mortal kings of the earth, as he sets up his permanent, terrestrial, and celestial kingdom. Now let's take a closer look at King Nebuchadnezzar's dream image that depicts the succession of world-ruling empires from the time of ancient Babylon to the final 10-toed nation empire that will experience the second coming of Jesus Christ. Before we continue, I want you to notice how all these empires controlled pretty much the same swath of land over time, in which included Jerusalem as the crown jewel, especially noting that Jerusalem is the apple of God's eye per Zechariah chapter 2 verse 8. This detail is key in understanding where this final 10-nation empire will rule from just before the second coming of Christ to the earth, which I believe will be first and only to the area of the Middle East per Isaiah chapter 63 verse 1 through 3, Zechariah chapter 14, and Revelation chapter 19 and 20. But back to the image per Daniel chapter 2 verse 31 through 45. We see a series of nations listed, with each being correlated with a specific element with varying terrestrial and extraterrestrial origin, which indicates an overt and progressive supernatural melding of the physical and spiritual world just before the return of Christ. Now, in connection to the overall trajectory of objective history, we first see the singular Babylonian Empire as the head of gold, then the Medo-Persian Empire being the torso and of 2 arms and silver, then the thighs of brass being the Grecian Empire, and then the 2 legs of iron being the Roman Empire, and lastly the 2 feet and 10 toes of iron and clay mixed together. We interestingly see the element of iron that is representative of the Roman period being also part of the final 10-nation empire of clay, in which Christ, depicted as the celestial stone formed without hands, comes to strike at the base of the 2 feet and 10 toes, thus destroying the image altogether, and then grows from a stone and into a great mountain that envelops the entire world. If you open any secular history book and look at the map of empires over the millennia, you can see how this passage of the book of Daniel is indeed an accurate ancient account of the future empires that would and did come after the Babylonian rule, all the way up until the fall and division of the Ottoman Turkish Empire after World War I from 1914 to 1918, and resulted in the formation of the current regional map of the Middle Eastern nation states, in which I believe will comprise the 10 toes and 10 horns of end-time Bible prophecy. But I'll leave you to research all this further on your own if you're not already familiar with this subject. But I'd like to emphasize that the 10 toes likely represent an expanded end-time nation of Israel within the original God-given Abrahamic borders per Genesis chapter 15 verse 18, in which Israel will finally dwell in after having consumed their current Arab and Islamic neighbors. But under the Antichrist, that greater Israel land area will be divided up for gain per Daniel chapter 11:39, which will likely involve the partition of Israel into a 10 regional empire state under the Antichrist and false prophets rule, and will make up the coming new end-time prophetic map of the Middle East, in which Daniel chapter 7 verses 20 through 25 and Revelation chapter 17 verse 12 describes a 10-nation empire symbolized by toes that are ruled by 10 kings, which are symbolized by horns, in which Christ comes directly back to in order to destroy this adulteration of his land and his people of Israel that will be playing the harlot at that time. Notably, there is currently a plan of Gaza being co-ruled by a multinational board of peace, just approved by the UN Security Council a few days ago, in which we can now plausibly see that partitioning of land under a multinational co-ruling body model can morph into the prophetic description of what we see described in the end-time prophetic scriptures. So this focus on Israel and the Middle East region is further supported by the fact that we know per scripture that the entire world will be focused on Israel in the end per Zechariah chapter 12, and that Christ himself returns to the Middle East and Israel first and only upon his second coming, and not to Europe, not Italy or the Vatican, not Africa, not Asia, nor America. It has always been about Israel in that specific area of the Middle East, as it all began there and will all conclude there. As a side note, I must note the significance of how pivotal Britain was in Israel's rebirth as a nation, as it was Britain's involvement in World War I that resulted in the fall of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which made it possible for the future creation of the nation of Israel. And in 1917, via the Balfour Declaration, paved the way for the reestablishment of the state of Palestine, in which Britain held the ruling mandate of, until Israel was inevitably given independence in May 1948 via the United Nations, which was formerly known as the League of Nations prior to 1946. Therefore, all these facts are key factors in identifying who the merchants of Tarshish are in Ezekiel chapter 38, in which I'll cover in part 2 of the video titled Rapture and Gog and Magog War 7 Years Before Tribulation 2060 video on my channel. I highly recommend that you watch that video next if you already haven't. But until then, thanks for sticking around and pottering the prophetic with me. Please join me in the next videos as we continue to dive into topics related to the final 14 years.